Good morning, everyone. We just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. Our guest today is Dr. Dominic Reisig, who is a professor and extension specialist at NC State University. He supports broadacre crops. Today's presentation will focus on his US experiences with BT corn and cotton and caterpillar pests. Dominic's going to outline the resistance problem, why stewardship is essential, and how behaviour change approaches were used to shift practices. This session will cover what was recommended, what worked and what didn't, and lessons beyond broadacre cropping.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present today. As Wendy mentioned, I'm happy to share my experience with broadacre crops in the US. And I know we have a very diverse audience, and hopefully they'll cover everything in detail. But if anything's confusing, please feel free to let me know that slow down or whatever else. Um, Wendy mentioned when she heard me speak in a previous presentation that she was looking up what some things were. So I thought I just might define, what is a BT crop? In the US, we have crops that are genetically engineered to express certain toxins that are very specific for insect pests. Some of these are very specific for caterpillar pests. Some of these are very specific for beetle pests. And they're great because they are very targeted for those pests, but have very other limited impacts on things like natural enemies, things like predators and parasites that eat the pests in the crop. And they're safe for human and animal consumption as well. And so this has been a big change for us in pest management over the, uh, I guess, past 30 years since we've been growing them because we're able to reduce our reliance on foliar and soil applied insecticides. The area that I'm located in the US is in North Carolina, and I've just overlaid some of the crop acreages here, for example, in cotton, so you can see where we are in cotton production in relation to the rest of the US. It's a kind of a far northern growing region, so we have some unique challenges just growing so far on the edge of where we can profitably produce cotton in the US. And if you situate that on a map that shows where trees and whatnot are, you can see that in the eastern US, where I'm located, we get abundant rainfall. Things are very green. And you can contrast that with some of our far western cotton growing regions, which are really arid and irrigated. 95% of the cotton where I'm located is rain fed, whereas 100% of the cotton in a place that you're looking at, like Arizona, is irrigated. And as a result, we have very different pest management challenges. They have a very unique story of pest management in Arizona, where they've gone through a series of experiences with different insecticides and pest complex. You can see that in the early 1990s, they were using broad spectrum insecticides. They had a diverse suite of insect pests, including whitefly, pink bollworm, lygus bug, or plant bugs. And you can see that as they introduced selective pesticides into the system, their pest complex shifted, as well as their insecticide use dropped. That moved into different things until where now they're actually in 2025 averaged under a single average insecticide spray for growers in that area of the US. It's a very different story from where I'm located, where the history is dominated by a pest called boll weevil. Boll weevil really influenced cotton acres grown in the state. So, for example, in the 1920s, there were nearly 700,000 hectares of cotton grown in North Carolina in 80 out of 100 counties in the state. And you can see that by 1978, because of the boll weevil, we were growing very, very little cotton. It just wasn't profitable. Once the boll weevil was eradicated, areas of the cotton of the state began growing cotton again. And then BT cotton was introduced in 1996 and helped us even more with our pest complex. It was just a very difficult pest to control. It had multiple overlapping generations. The generation time from egg to adult averaged 18 to 21 days. It could be even shorter depending on environmental conditions. It was very mobile. The larvae was protected from insecticides because it fed inside of the squares and bolls. And for those of you who are not familiar with cotton terminology, a square is a pre-floral bud, and the boll is the fruit that develops that produces the lint from the seeds. And a lot of times, broad spectrum insecticides were used for boll weevil that flared other insect pests by releasing the system. We have a story similar to Arizona in terms of eliminating a pest and reducing sprays, but as you can see, we have a different story. So in North Carolina in the 1970s, the average number of applications for boll weevil on a field in the state were about 10 per season. It could be as high as 14, just depending on the year and the grower. Once boll weevil was eradicated, we reduced the average number of sprays to about 3 per season. When Bt cotton was introduced, it also changed our suite of insect pests, where we were down below 2 average sprays per season. And then the piercing sucking insect pests came in because we were no longer targeting insecticides for those caterpillar pests that Bt cotton killed. So we just had a very different story from Arizona. But Bt cotton was really good for our system because it eliminated a suite of caterpillar pests that once targeted cotton. You can see the pest called fall armyworm in the top left. There's some injury from European corn borer in the top center. We had soybean loopers even that you can see on the top right, a pest called tobacco budworm and corn earworm, and then even something called beet armyworm. The major pest, though, of cotton in the southern U.S. was tobacco budworm or Chloridea fluorescens. It had a history of insecticide resistance. It evolved resistance to the organochlorines in the 1950s, the carbamates in the 60s, organophosphates, and then the pyrethroids. So you could see each one of these classes just falling, falling, falling with over-reliance on a single class of chemistries. The story was especially stark in the state of Alabama, which is kind of between the southeast and mid-southern U.S. In 1995, they sprayed 100% of their cotton acres with insecticide. They averaged 6.7 sprays per season, and these were primarily directed at tobacco budworm. And they lost over 250,000 bales of cotton from this insect pest. Growers very readily planted Bt varieties in 1996 when it was introduced. And in 1996, they sprayed only 11% of their acres with insecticide. We don't know how many sprays they sprayed on average. We don't have those records, but they lost only just north of 33,000 bales from insect pests. So it was just a really, really successful program. So Bt cotton has completely eliminated tobacco budworm as a problem in cotton in the US, where it was one of the most damaging pests. It has never been known to survive on Bt cotton. And it's eliminated many of the other insect pests that are caterpillars in the system as well. We don't have issues from fall armyworm or soybean looper or beet armyworm or European corn borer. But it was never a 100% effective product for bollworm, which is also called corn earworm, or Helicoverpazea. These are end of season damage estimates from the 1990s and 1980s. And you can see that the percentage of damaged bolls on average from 1985 to 1995 in non-Bt cotton was around 4%. In 1996, pretty typical, 4% damaged bolls. But in Bt cotton, for the product called Bollgard, it was only roughly half that of non-Bt cotton. So it wasn't 100% effective. Like tobacco budworm, this is a very difficult pest to treat. It's very similar to the pest that you have in Australia, Old World bollworm. In fact, they share the same genus, and so they have a very similar life history. They eat many different plants, and that's reflective in their common name, corn earworm, bollworm, or tomato fruitworm. And when they can't eat plants, they will eat each other. So they'll eat just about anything. A single female can lay up to 2,500 eggs in the lab. I've collected field insects and they lay roughly 200 to 300 eggs per female, but still a lot of eggs. They can migrate, they can diapause, which means that they can change their physiology such that they can survive harsh conditions like winter. And they have many generations a year, and they have also evolved resistance to many insecticides similar to the tobacco budworm. Just to give you a feeling for their biology, we're going to pick a crop like corn, which is one of their preferred hosts. The moth female lays her eggs on the silk. They really like to lay their eggs on flowering crops. And then the larvae develops in tandem as the grain of the crop develops, or the seed. And in the case of corn, the neonate, or that little first instar that hatches, eats down the silk and feeds in the tip of the plant. Once completes feeding, it'll either chew a hole in the husk or come out the top. It'll silk down to the soil, dig into the soil, and form a pupal arresting stage where it changes from a caterpillar to an adult, and then it emerges to attack other crops in the season. And if we look at it, we can see that it goes through a series of crops in a single season. We can detect moths emerging from overwintering in where I'm located in April or May. That first generation goes through on corn or other non-crop hosts. The second generation is primarily out of corn. The third generation is through a series of different crops in the landscape, whatever is most attractive for them to feed on. And then we don't know much about later generations throughout the year. And as the season progresses, there's a mixture of moths that are produced locally and also migratory individuals, such that you may be dealing with an insect that didn't even develop on a crop in that area. Even though it looks like we're really able to predict what this insect does, every year is a little bit different. So you see this graph on the left that shows the peaks and valleys of this insect that we're able to trap and catch in traps as adults each year. And you can see that sometimes those peaks happen early, sometimes they happen late, sometimes they're distinct, sometimes they're not distinct. And importantly, we grow many of the crops that express Bt in overlapping areas in the US. So cotton expresses Bt and corn expresses Bt, and we grow these in the same area. And because of that, we're exposing this insect to Bt over multiple generations in the year. In my state of North Carolina, uh, corn earworm may be exposed to Bt corn in the first generation, the second generation, and the third generation, and even Bt cotton in the third generation. And so you can imagine with these series of crops that they're using, the multiple generations in a year, the potential selective exposure is very high, and the risk for resistance is very high, even from a single growing season. In terms of pest status, you will find corn earworm on vegetative stage corn. It's not super common. It really likes the ear of the corn. Despite the fact that this looks really bad, you've got a corn earworm feeding in the tip of the corn ear. We have many studies that show that corn earworm is generally not a yield limiting pest. The plant is actually able to compensate for that injury on the tip by filling out kernels in the base of the tip. Now, of course, it's a biological system. This doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes we do have yield loss, but generally, these studies show that this is not a yield limiting pest. In contrast, a pest that you're unfortunately dealing with now is fall armyworm, and this is a very yield limiting pest in corn. It actually prefers to attack whorl stage corn, and it will feed in the ear with corn earworm. And when we have fall armyworm and corn earworm present in the ear, especially in later planted corn, these are places where we can see yield loss. In contrast, cotton can have 100% yield losses from corn earworm, which we call bollworm in cotton. This is a photo taken with Bt cotton on the left and non-Bt cotton on the right. And you can see how damaging this insect pest can be. This is not an unusual photo for the location where I took the photo, but we typically don't see yield losses this high across the US cotton belt. This is a particularly prone location for bollworm and cotton. And corn earworm also feeds on soybeans. In my state, it's almost always the #1 insect pest of soybeans. And importantly, soybeans in the US do not have BT like they do in other parts of the world. So you can imagine with all these different crops that we grow, that the landscape is important. And it's really, really complicated when we think about resistance management because we have to think about the environment, we have to think about locally developing individuals, we have to think about migratory individuals. But we are getting some clues from recent studies about what makes what makes important factors for population development for corn earworm or Helicoverpazea. So we know from landscape studies that some of the most important things for our populations are the numbers from the last season. It stands to reason if we had a lot of corn earworm last season, we might have more corn earworm the next season. Last season precipitation is important. We know that precipitation has an impact on pupae as they overwinter. We also know that it affects hosts that they use. Latitude's important, with some latitudes having more corn earworm and some having less. And then soybean is such an important thing to the system because, like I told you, it's a non-BT crop. And so a lot of these insects are coming from soybeans as a source, and we have a lot of soybean acres in the state relative to corn and cotton acres. Okay, so now that I've given you some background about the biology of the insect, I want to talk a little bit about our story and experience with BT resistance. And I want to start this in 2015. These are season-long damaged bolls in cotton. And I have non-BT cotton on the left, where roughly 40-some% of the bolls were affected season-long from bollworm. I have a product that was called Wide Strike, which expresses two BT proteins, Cry1AC and Cry1F. And I have a product called Wide Strike 3, which expresses Cry1AC, Cry1F, and a VIP protein. And you can see that there were very few damaged bolls in Wide Strike. It wasn't 100% effective, but it was very effective. And the product that contained that VIP protein had essentially no injury. Fast forward to 2016, the very next year, and it became very apparent because the pressure of this insect was so high that unfortunately we had resistance to the BT proteins. The graph on the left is showing damaged sweet corn ears over time. The yellow dots indicate damage in non-BT corn, and you can see that that's relatively constant over time. And the blue dots represent BT sweet corn, and you notice that the injury from the insect was increasing over time. The graph on the right is from cotton. It's looking at percent of fields with damaged bolls at the end of the season, and you can see that there was the damage was actually decreasing over time until about 2016 when it spiked. And so since that time, we have confirmed resistance to Cry1 families and Cry2 families, meaning that the only remaining effective protein for corn earworm in cotton is VIP protein. We have very, very similar VIP proteins in corn and cotton. In cotton, they're that number 19. In corn, they're that number 20. They're just very, very similar. So it it was really apparent that if we wanted to steward the use of this VIP protein, that we would have to do things different for resistance management going forward. So our current resistance management program relies on high dose and refuge. What do I mean by that? Basically, we want to have enough BT out there that it kills any of those insects that may be carrying resistance in their genetics. So we want to have a really, really high dose to do that. We can accomplish that in a number of different ways. We can engineer the plant such that it expresses more proteins. We can put proteins together in a way that they call pyramiding. And we also want to rely on refuge. Refuge is a place where individuals can develop, not be exposed to that BT toxin, and hopefully emerge from that crop to mate with resistant individuals that develop in the BT crop, essentially drowning the resistance out. And one of the things I became aware of over time is I can't do a whole lot about the dose. The dose is really something that has to happen in product development, and it has to happen with the product developers. But maybe working in extension and with growers, I could do something about refuge. One of the things that growers in the southern United States are required to do is if they grow Bt corn, they are required to plant 20% of their total corn acres to non-Bt hybrids. So 80% can be Bt and 20% can be non-Bt. But most growers are not doing this. It is something that's required, but just not enforced. And the other thing I wanted to think about is, could we detect resistance sooner? That's not really something I'm going to talk about today. The first thing I want to talk about is a program run by former Monsanto, now Bayer Crop Science, called the Southern Land Legacy Program. And the Southern Land Legacy Program was very interesting because it relied on moral suasion. You'll see the photo on the right of the grower here. Uh, he wouldn't mind if I told you his name. His name is Jay Sullivan, and he actually is a grower that planted non-Bt refuge. And so the company took advantage of growers like him and put them on billboards and created a program where growers that purchased the proper amount of non-Bt seed could be entered in a contest to donate money to a nonprofit of their choice. And there were billboards and advertisements saying things like planting the refuge because it's the right thing to do. Well, the company ran this program for a year, and based on seed sales the next year, they actually increased the non-Bt seed sales from about 2.5 to close to 6% over the baseline. So this program worked. It was great, but it was also very expensive, and so it wasn't continued in the future. But it really got me thinking about what could be done. And one of the things that kind of struck me at the time is, um, in order to speak to people that to get them to trust you, it's important that we speak the same language. This photo here is me, my uncle, who's now passed away, and two of my cousins. They live in the state of Montana. And one thing that always strikes me when I look in the photo is which of these people does not belong. And I think if you look at the guy on the far left that's wearing blue shoes, you can see that that's me. And I'm speaking to people and growers that look more like my uncle and my cousins. And so what can we do to get on the same language so that we both trust each other when we come from so many different places? When I'm a person at a university coming into a grower meeting and telling them to do something, what is it that it is going to cause them to trust me? One of the things that I did was I gave them more information. So I told growers about um, the benefits of planting refuge, the benefits of planting non-Bt corn, the requirements. And I surveyed them both before and after I gave them this presentation on all this information. And I didn't move the needle one bit. Just the same amount of growers said they were going to plant non-Bt corn refuge before the presentation as after the presentation. And although I was able to boost their knowledge in the short term, I was not able to boost their knowledge in the medium or long term. And it was even worse than that. I actually asked them also, what's the average size of your farm? And the the smaller the farm was, you can see the farm acres on the left, the more likely they were to not plant non-Bt refuge. And this was an almost intractable problem to me because it's fairly easy for me to reach large growers, right? I can talk to one grower and impact a lot of acreage, but it's much harder to reach those smaller size growers because there's so many more of them and they're already not doing what I want them to do. So I began to work with social scientists and economists. And one of the things that they wanted me to try was an emotional appeal. It's nothing fancy. It was just a series of vignettes and stories that I told the growers. I told them stories about cooperation. One of the stories was about overfishing in England. One of the stories was about working collectively together on drainage issues to solve water drainage. And another story was on how we had to work together to solve resistance. And this emotional appeal was actually fairly successful. Before I gave the emotional appeal, roughly 60% of the growers said they weren't going to plant refuge. And after the emotional appeal, about 40% of the growers said they were going to uh, plant refuge. So, I mean, to me, this was really, really exciting. This was something that we wanted to expand. So, really wanted to come up with a new plan. The first thing we can do is we're going to talk about is something called rib. One of the things we can do is actually force refuge on the growers. You can actually mix seeds of BT and non-BT together and just get growers to plant them. If you have a bag and some of them has BT and non-BT seeds, you can plant refuge. The way we plant it now is we say growers, plant a little separate block of this on your own. Well, why not just mix it in the bag? Well, one of the things that they showed with science is that with these little emergence cages, we actually are producing the same number of insects when we blend the non-BT and BT seeds in together as we do when they plant them in a block. But this plan has a little bit of an Achilles heel for ear-feeding pests because corn is wind pollinated. And when the BT plant pollen mixes with the non-BT plant pollen, we're actually creating sublethal doses of BT in those ears. And you know what happens when you don't take your antibiotic as long as you're supposed to, right? We create those sublethal doses in spaces where those critters can evolve resistance. And we have actually showed that in a single generation, we can detect the genetics for BT resistance when we blend those pieces of pollen together. So the other thing I did was modify that extension appeal. We don't want to blend those refuge seeds together. What can we do to modify that appeal? This is the economist that I told you I was working with previously, Zach Brown, but he recruited a very talented PhD student into his department that was part of this interdisciplinary fellowship called Ag Biofuse. One of the things that Zach noticed when he came to my part of the state is that we're very flat and we have lots of issues with drainage. And he would talk to some growers that really were happy with their drainage management system and they worked together with other growers to maintain it and everything was hunky-dory. And if you think about drainage, it really is something that you have to work together on because you can drain your fields just fine, but when it comes to that common outlet where everyone is draining into, if that's not draining fine, then you have problems. And he talked to some growers who they had no common drainage management together. He talked to some growers that were in some drainage management districts that were working well and some that weren't. And what he got to thinking about was something called conditional cooperation. Conditional cooperation is a very simple concept. It's the idea of I will cooperate, but only if you will cooperate. And he said, okay, there's already areas where growers are cooperating and not cooperating. So can we layer the willingness to plant refuge on top of those drainage management intentions? That is to say, are growers that are already cooperating on drainage, will they be more likely to cooperate on non-BT refuge planting? We targeted my extension efforts. So we did this in meetings with growers. We did this in this drainage poor region. And then we measured the outcome of this in different treatments. And what I mean by treatment is I did the intervention in some areas and not in other areas. And the intervention was a very simple game that growers played to measure conditional cooperation. The PhD student I mentioned earlier came up with this, and he created a situation where Joe and Joe's neighbor had a common weed problem. And Joe could contribute to the weed problem in different ways. He could contribute 100%, he could contribute a little bit, none at all, or he could contribute some if his neighbor contributed. And so, based on how they played that game, we were able to identify those growers as cooperative or not cooperative. So, what did it look like when we layered that on top of the intention to plant refuge? In half of these, where I gave the emotional appeal, 16% were more likely to plant some refuge, and 20% were more likely to plant the required refuge. So we thought that was really interesting, and it kind of mirrored the results I showed you earlier, where we gave that emotional appeal and growers said they were more willing to plant refuge. Related to drainage management, we found that in areas where they were already cooperating on drainage, there were 3 times more conditional cooperators and 6 times more altruists. So that makes sense, right? Like if they're cooperating on drainage, they should be more cooperative. But what we found that was unexpected is they were already more likely to plant refuge. And I guess maybe that shouldn't be unexpected, but it was to me. So those two things track together. And they were not responsive to the emotional appeal. So we don't know if this is because they were already planting refuge and they didn't need to hear my message or what, but just wasn't exactly what we expected to find. So our conclusions from this study were that cooperative growers were more receptive to refuge, less cooperative growers were more receptive to the emotional appeal, and just want to get you thinking about what might serve as a proxy for cooperation in other areas, because I imagine, like the US, Australia is extremely diverse, and it's not going to be the same for you as it is for me. Not everybody's going to worry about drainage. You may be worried about irrigation or having agricultural cooperatives or working together on nutrient management plans. If there can be areas of cooperation that are identified, there may be areas of wins for resistance management in those areas. The last thing I want to talk about is our evaluation that we've done for non-BT hybrids. What we wanted to do is figure out some of the reasons why growers are not planting non-BT hybrids. One of the things we kind of thought is, well, maybe there's a perception out there that they don't yield as well. A lot of growers kind of told me that. Well, I planted non-BT and I just didn't I just didn't like it. But I'm thinking, okay, I'm a scientist though. Did you put this on poor soils? Did you plant it last? What could else be what could be influencing that? Maybe is it not does it not have good genetic yield potential? I don't know. So one of the things that we did in 2023 is we planted pairs of BT and non-BT hybrids in about 60 locations in the state. We used grower equipment, grower fields, grower measurements, and part of this was to let them touch and taste the the product themselves when they planted it. We had a student assigned to the project. She did a very good, complete job, tested the plants for BT and measured all the insect feeding that was there. But what I want to focus on today is what do we see in terms of yield? And that's what this graph is showing, just the different average yielding, uh, the different yields on average between these hybrids in 2022 and 2023. Now, what you're looking at in the shaded gray graphs are BT hybrids, and what you're looking at in the colored graphs are the non-BT hybrids. And if you look at the pairs, DKC is one hybrid pair, and if you look at the Pioneer hybrid pair, you'll notice that in each year, the BT and the non-BT hybrids yield the same. Now, they yield differently between years. There may be some differences between companies, but if we just look at within a company, a hybrid pair that's of the same relative maturity, we're not seeing any difference in yield. So we thought that was pretty interesting. It actually mirrored a lot of work we've been doing on small plots, a lot of work we've been doing on small plots. But what we really wanted to take that to was the next step with economics. So we collaborated with another person in the ag a resource and economics department, and he sliced this a bunch of different ways. But the one I want to show you today is the profits for 1,000 acres with 20% refuge compared to planting all BT. So the profit for planting your farm to 100% BT is on the left. Those are big standard error bars. And the profit for planting 80% BT and 20% non-BT are on the right. And you notice that they're exactly the same. So we found it interesting that we can yield the same, we can actually make the same profit if we plant refuge. One of the last things I want to show you about today is just a quick survey of seed dealers and growers. We actually do a lot of surveys with our growers and dealers about just trying to figure out what are some of the limitations that are there? And, we found things like a lot of our seed dealers aren't selling enough non-BT seed. So, for example, on the far left graph, you notice that the estimated total percent of non-BT corn seed, um, the estimated percent of total corn seed sold that was non-BT was mostly between 0 and 10%. Well, if we're requiring our growers to plant 20% non-BT seed and they're not selling 20% non-BT seed, we have a problem. So there's just a lot of different ways we can look at this. One of the big things that a lot of this work ended up in was some new proposed regulations. This came out in January 2025, and what the United States Environmental Protection Agency is proposing is that corn growers purchase the required amount of non-BT seed when they purchase their BT seed at the point of sale. Now, this proposal would not require the growers to plant it, but at least they'd have to buy it and have a pretty good chance at planting it. Again, this is still a proposal. Seemed like it was gaining some traction going forward. We've had a change of administration, so it's kind of stalled out at this point, but this is something that's on the table. Just want to end this with a few conclusions. I think these are important things for you to take forward. Um, we do have good control of a lot of our pests in BT cotton in the US, but it's very important that we maintain that control by delaying resistance. And we have to do that with unique and creative ways. We can't do that with business as usual. We also have a rapidly changing landscape. I didn't spend a lot of time on talking about this, but if you think back on that graph of North Carolina sprays, I had a bunch of purple on there where we were actually increasing our sprays in BT cotton for piercing sucking insects. We actually have a new BT product in cotton that targets piercing sucking insect pests. And we do expect the pest management landscape to change going forward as a result of this. And then finally, it's just so important to remember the human aspect because we can understand all of the biology, but we really have to understand the behavior of those who are trying to manage that biology. So I thank you so much for this opportunity.
Awesome. Thank you so much for presenting. I mean, that was certainly a wealth of information, and I feel I've learned a lot from that. If there's anyone here with any questions, if you could pop them in the Q&A, I'll read them out. Just while you're doing that, I just wanted to ask, you did mention that the smaller growers were often less willing to plant the non-BT cotton. Is there any reason, or were you able to identify anything that might have led to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's some sociological predictions that are way out of my area of expertise.
Mhm.
But just in my experience, the reason I started even looking at that question was because I was presenting to growers in a small county, and a lot of them are part-time growers, so they have other jobs and they farm on the side. And I presented this information on non-BT corn, and one of the growers came up to me after the meeting and asked, "What's BT corn?" And I thought, "Oh my
Oh.
goodness, you're planting it." So, some of it might be information, but there's a lot of other reasons I'm sure why.
Yeah. Oh no, that's really interesting. I mean, the crop that I work most of the time with is strawberries. So we often find some of our smaller farms can actually adapt and make little changes, a bit more with a bit more agility than some of our larger farms, whereas our larger farms have, I guess, the funds, that capital to actually make changes. I just have one other question. I'll just give everyone another minute. Obviously, you've covered a lot because I'm not seeing any questions pop up. Um, the other thing I just wanted to ask was how was the public perception to BT crops? I mean, obviously you've had these growers that have had their images on billboards. How was that received by the public?
I think within the grower community themselves, they've been growing these crops for 30 years. So, to them there's no issue. And I think a lot of the growers have come around to the fact that there are going to be some public that are not going to accept genetically engineered crops in food crops. And so to them, some of them see that as a niche market. So sweet corn is a great example because we can grow BT sweet corn and we also have a lot of non-BT sweet corn. So you'll have some growers that grow both BT sweet corn and non-BT sweet corn, and they just spray it every day to keep the ear feeding pests out, right? And so to them, it's not an issue. It seems like just in the ether, the public debate of this has kind of died down as we are so polar on so many other issues. We're not worried about we're not worried about BT crops. It doesn't seem like so much anymore.
Excellent. No, I think that's fantastic. I think often the public doesn't seem to recognize that the benefit of these genetically modified crops is that reduced pesticide usage. And I do often wonder, I mean, we're not at that stage with our industry. I know others probably are. If that is perhaps something that we need to focus on that external marketing point of view. Um, Look, you must have covered absolutely everything because there are no questions. We have had one of our participants say thank you and that it was absolutely fascinating and very useful. So thank you again for. Oh no, I think we've got something just pop up in the Q&A. Okay, excellent. So you're not let off that easy. The question comes from Jesse. I've got a couple of questions now. Is there a work with model growers to champion BT cotton best practice? And if so, has it been effective, like outside of that Bayer campaign?
Yeah, is there work with the model growers? I would say um, somewhat yes. It's not, I would say it's not a organized campaign on the top-down level. It seems like more bottom up. So you had asked about the smaller growers, Wendy. A lot of the larger growers are the ones that are planting non-BT because they're big customers, right? And so the
Yeah,
companies, they're very close to the companies, and the companies work with them. Everybody wants them to plant the non-BT seed, so they do it. They know that they're maybe kind of an easy target, right?
yeah.
And then it's also, if you think about insecticide resistance as a common pool resource, the larger you are, the more the it should. I'm searching for the words here, but it's in your best interest to plant non-BT, right, and delay resistance because I'm actually affecting that pool more than a smaller grower who may not make a difference.
Mm,
So I would say the levels for model growers are more from the bottom up.
okay, fantastic. I think that's another important thing, when you're talking about the smaller growers not having that awareness. I mean, they're not really anybody's economic target, are they? So it may just be a bit of that natural consequence. They're not going to have that impact on resistance. They're not going to have that impact on someone's bottom line. So they can kind of miss being a target of information and extension. We had another question here. Your point on trust was important. Do you still find a strong us versus them attitude when you're speaking as a researcher?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. Uh, I, the U.S. is very culturally different, right? So I grew up in Southern California. And I here in North Carolina, it's Southern U.S. culture, so it was very different growing here. And um, I'm also 2 hours east of main campus, so I'm embedded in a rural community. And the logic for doing that is twofold. Number one, I'm majority extension, smaller research faculty member. So with extension, I need to be out here with the clientele. And the second reason is our insect pressure is higher in this part of the state. And so coming in from the outside, it took a long time to gain trust and acceptance, but I've been here 17 years now and I am part of the community. And so I think just the time being here and being embedded in the community has melted a lot of that away. And that's nothing I've done. It's just time.
But maybe it is also that it's the fact that over those years you've proven that you're there long haul. Because I think just simply being a placeholder there is not enough. I think it's probably far not just I guess from my outside thing here that I can see that there's probably a lot that you've done to foster that trust over those years. Um, Excellent. Well, there are no more questions for everybody that's attended. If you've missed the beginning, because I know some of you joined late, we are going to have this online. It's been recorded. It'll be available online in the next couple of weeks, and we'll send everybody a link so you can watch it and share it later. If not, thanks very much for attending, everyone. Thank you, Dominic, for taking the time. I know that the time zone differences have not been kind to you, but we really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Yeah, pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye.